Halloween night in rural Alabama. An 80-year-old veteran dials 911, his voice shaking. "Don't do that. Leave me alone. What do you want?" In the background, the intruder demands one thing. "Where's the vault?" Seconds later, the call goes silent. What happened inside that house would haunt Alabama forever. 8 years later, in the summer of 2013, a young man is led into Alabama's death chamber. Only 29 years old, his wrists strapped down, his face blank as the prison warden leans over and asks if he has any final words. The man simply replies, "No, sir, I don't." Within minutes, the lethal drugs begin to flow, and Alabama carries out its first execution in nearly 2 years. The man on the gurney was Andrew Lackey. To some, he was a monster who carried out one of the most senseless crimes the state had ever seen. To others, he was a deeply troubled young man who seemed eager to die, who even wrote to the courts asking them to set his execution date. But what could drive someone so young to such a brutal act, and then to throw away every chance of appeal? Tonight, we're going to trace the path that led from that chilling 911 call on Halloween night to Andrew Lackey's final meal, his last words, and the crime that made Alabama decide he had to die. On October 31, 2005, in Athens, Alabama, 22-year-old Andrew Lackey forced his way into the home of 80-year-old Charles Newman, a retired World War II paratrooper. Newman had already put on his pajamas for the night when the break-in happened. Startled and terrified, he quickly dialed 911. The emergency call captured his trembling voice as he begged, "Don't do that. Leave me alone. What do you want?" In the background, Lackey can be heard demanding only one thing. "Where's the vault? Where's the vault?" Lackey's obsession came from information fed to him by Newman's grandson, who had told him his grandfather was a wealthy man, hiding piles of cash and gold bars inside a vault in the house. Whether such a vault truly existed or not, it was enough to drive Lackey to break into the home on Halloween night. Newman refused to yield. Despite his age, he still had the fight of a soldier in him. He reached for his pistol and fired, hitting Lackey, but instead of stopping the attack, it escalated the violence. Wounded and enraged, Lackey pulled a knife and launched a savage assault. He stabbed Newman over 70 times with such force that the blade eventually broke, leaving its tip lodged inside the old man's skull. Then, Lackey picked up Newman's own gun and shot him in the chest. When detectives entered the house later, they were met with a horrific scene. Charles Newman's body was found lying on the floor between a couch and a green chair, surrounded by a large pool of blood. The veteran who had once survived jumping into battle overseas had been slaughtered in his own living room, not by foreign enemies but by a young man from his own community, desperate and misled. This crime sent shockwaves through Alabama. Investigators would quickly piece together the details, linking Andrew Lackey to the brutal killing. After the brutal killing of Charles Newman, Andrew Lackey fled the scene, bleeding from the gunshot wound the 80-year-old veteran had managed to inflict during the struggle. But the injury was too serious to ignore. In a panic, Lackey drove away into the Alabama night, hoping to find help before he collapsed. His flight ended at a Chevron gas station, not far from the crime scene. Weak and desperate, he staggered inside and used the phone to call for help, claiming he needed medical attention. When police and paramedics arrived, they quickly realized this wasn't an ordinary injury. Lackey was evasive, refusing to explain how he had been shot. The story didn't add up, and investigators began to suspect there was more behind his wounds. He was rushed to Huntsville Hospital, where doctors treated him under police watch. The bullet had passed through, leaving a trail of evidence behind. When officers searched his belongings, the first clue emerged. A .38 caliber Rossi revolver registered in Lackey's name. But it wasn't just the gun that tied him to Newman's home. It was the blood on his clothes, his shoes, and his vehicle. Forensic teams meticulously compared the evidence. The jeans Lackey wore that night were stained with Newman's blood. His shoe prints matched those found inside the ransacked home. Metal fragments recovered at the crime scene were consistent with items connected to Lackey. Even the 911 call, which captured his voice demanding the vault, placed him at the center of the crime. Within hours, the picture became undeniable. Andrew Lackey, a 22-year-old from Huntsville, had not only murdered Charles Newman, he had also left behind an ironclad trail of evidence that police and prosecutors would later describe as overwhelming. His attempt to hide the truth unraveled almost immediately, and the state of Alabama prepared to make an example of him. Charles Newman was more than just an elderly man living alone in Athens, Alabama. Born in 1925, he had lived through the most dangerous battles of the 20th century. As a paratrooper in the 101st Airborne Division, Newman parachuted into France during the D-Day invasion of Normandy, surviving a war that claimed countless lives. After returning home, he built a life as a contractor and raised a family. By 2005, he was retired, 80 years old, and known for his toughness. Some even described him as mean and rich, a reputation that would tragically draw danger to his door. On Halloween night, Newman tried to defend himself when a friend of his grandson forced his way into his home. He fought back bravely, even shooting his attacker once, but the odds were stacked against him. What followed was a violent robbery that ended the life of a man who had survived the deadliest war in history. Before the crime, Andrew was just a boy growing up in Alabama. Andrew Lackey was born on October 29, 1983, in Alabama to Michael and Sharon Lackey. From the very beginning, his family sensed something was different about him. His mother, Sharon, later testified that even as an infant, Andrew seemed to live in what she called Andrew Land, a quiet, withdrawn world of his own. When he was just weeks old, Sharon realized something wasn't right. Andrew nearly starved himself because he refused to breastfeed. Doctors warned he had failed to thrive and might not survive unless he switched to bottle feeding. Even then, he would only drink from the bottle if he was turned away from his mother, as though even the comfort of eye contact was too much for him to process. Growing up, Andrew remained different. He was ambidextrous, something that initially seemed like a gift but soon raised concerns. A physician suggested that using both hands equally might be straining his brain development. The solution offered was unusual: let him play computer games to force him to pick a dominant hand. By age 5, Andrew spent hours alone in front of an Atari console, mastering every game available. It kept him occupied, but it also deepened his isolation. Family members described him as passive and non-violent, but painfully asocial. His aunt recalled that whenever someone entered a room, Andrew would quietly turn his face toward the wall, retreating further into himself. Teachers and friends alike noticed he was quiet, introverted, and socially awkward. By adolescence, psychologists believed Andrew showed signs of being on the autism spectrum, possibly Asperger's syndrome. His IQ was average, and experts agreed he understood right from wrong. But his emotional world was stunted. He lacked social connections, communication skills, and the ability to navigate normal relationships. He was the kind of young man who was easily led, easily manipulated, and desperate for belonging. That vulnerability would eventually place him in the orbit of Derek Newman, the grandson of Charles Newman. Andrew had been friends with Derek since the 4th grade, and Derek knew Andrew's weaknesses. According to testimony, Derek told him that his grandfather was mean and rich, a miser hoarding gold bars and stacks of cash inside a vault at his home. Andrew believed him. He was even persuaded by Derek to use money he earned as an eBay seller to buy car parts for him. To Andrew, who spent much of his life locked away inside Andrew Land, the idea of a vault full of treasure must have sounded like an adventure, a way to prove himself, maybe even a way to belong. But this belief would drag him out of his quiet world and into one of the most brutal crimes Alabama had ever seen. The trial of Andrew Lackey unfolded in 2008 inside the Limestone County Courthouse, a small Alabama courtroom heavy with tension. By then, the crime was already infamous. Prosecutors painted Lackey as a calculating young man who stalked his victim, Charles Newman, and brutally ended his life for nothing more than greed. But the defense had a different story, one that leaned on Andrew's fragile mind, his lifelong isolation, and the manipulative influence of his childhood friend Derek Newman. From the start, the prosecution's case was straightforward. They told jurors that on Halloween night 2005, Lackey broke into Charles Newman's Athens home armed with a pistol, a knife, and plastic restraints. Newman, an 80-year-old World War II paratrooper, fought back. The confrontation turned violent, and Lackey shot him once before stabbing him repeatedly. The jury saw crime scene photographs, harsh, unforgiving images that showed just how brutal the attack had been. Prosecutors argued that Andrew's intent was clear, robbery and murder. But the defense asked jurors to look deeper. Andrew's mother, Sharon, described him as different from the very beginning, an infant who wouldn't nurse, a boy who faced walls instead of people, a teenager who lived in Andrew land, detached and socially awkward. She and other relatives painted a picture of a young man ill-equipped to navigate life, let alone manipulate others. They pointed to Derek Newman as the instigator, the friend who allegedly told Andrew that his grandfather was mean and rich and had hidden cash and gold bars in a safe. Mental health became the core of the defense. Psychologists testified that Andrew showed possible signs of autism spectrum disorder, or Asperger's, traits that explained his passivity, his obsessive focus on video games, and his inability to connect with others. Yet he was also intelligent enough to earn money as an eBay seller. One expert admitted he had the IQ to know right from wrong, but suggested his condition made him highly susceptible to manipulation. The prosecution dismantled this argument by pointing out the meticulous planning. Lackey brought weapons, restraints, and even a change of clothes. They argued that no one coerced him into stabbing Charles Newman dozens of times. This was not the act of a manipulated boy, they said, but of a man who wanted easy money and was willing to kill for it. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the words were swift and final, guilty on all counts, including capital murder. During the penalty phase, Sharon pleaded for her son's life. She reminded the jury that he had no history of violence, no prior crimes, and a mental state that had always set him apart. But the prosecution countered that the crime's brutality outweighed every plea for mercy. In the end, the jury voted 11-1 in favor of death. Andrew Lackey, just 24 years old, was sentenced to die by lethal injection. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of the decision hanging heavy. For the Newman family, justice had been served. For the Lackeys, it was the confirmation of a nightmare, that their quiet, withdrawn boy would be executed by the state of Alabama. After the gavel came down in 2008, sentencing Andrew Lackey to death, he was shipped off to Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, the state's death row. For most inmates, this phase is about survival, appeals, lawyers, last-ditch efforts to delay the inevitable. But Andrew's story unfolded differently. Inmates often describe death row as a place where time stops. The walls are white, sterile, and suffocating, and the silence is broken only by the clang of metal doors and the shuffle of chains. For Andrew, a man who had already lived most of his life inside his own head, the isolation seemed almost natural. He didn't speak much to other prisoners. Guards remembered him as polite but eerily detached, as if he was drifting through the years in a haze. His lawyers filed automatic appeals, challenging the fairness of his trial, pointing to his long history of mental health struggles and possible developmental disorders. But Andrew himself showed little interest in fighting for his life. He rarely asked about legal updates and never joined the chorus of inmates claiming innocence. Unlike others, he admitted his crime. That quiet acceptance unnerved those around him. His family tried to stay in touch. His mother, Sharon, who had once nursed him through near starvation as a baby, wrote letters and visited when she could. But conversations were strained. Andrew's world had always been difficult for others to enter, and behind prison glass, it was nearly impossible. Over the years, something darker began to surface. Andrew didn't want to live on death row. He didn't want appeals. In fact, he began asking the courts to set an execution date. Mental health advocates stepped in, arguing he wasn't competent to make that decision. They pointed to his autism-like traits, his long history of withdrawal, and his flat emotional affect. But Andrew was adamant. Depression consumed him, and with it came thoughts he could no longer push away. He attempted suicide while incarcerated, his bid to escape the crushing weight of guilt, isolation, and the knowledge that the state planned to kill him. The attempt failed, but it revealed the depth of his despair. He wasn't fighting for appeals. He wasn't clinging to life. He was already letting go. Lawyers and activists later pointed to this attempt as evidence of his deteriorating mental state, echoing what his mother had long feared, that her son had never been fully able to cope with the world around him. Yet, in the eyes of the state, he remained competent, aware of his crime, and fit to be executed. Years dragged on, but Andrew never seemed to adjust to death row life. He stayed quiet, withdrawn, and increasingly resigned. While other inmates fought bitterly for appeals, Andrew's own fight seemed more with himself than with the courts. His death, in his mind, was no longer something to resist, but something he was already prepared to meet. He waived his right to appeals and wrote numerous letters to the court to set his execution date. On the morning of July 25, 2013, Andrew Lackey woke up inside Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, knowing it would be the last sunrise he would ever see. He was just 29 years old. For years he had sat on death row, isolated, haunted by what he had done, and at times driven so far into despair that he had even attempted suicide. But now the state of Alabama was going to finish what he once tried himself. Andrew was offered turkey bologna, French fries, and grilled cheese. He ate quietly, without protest, without comment. Unlike some condemned inmates who made grand statements through their last meals, Andrew's choice was simple, ordinary, almost childlike. It was the kind of meal you might grab from a roadside diner, not the kind you'd expect before death. As evening drew near, the ritual of execution began. Andrew was led into the death chamber, a cold room lit harshly, with a gurney placed at its center. He was strapped down, his arms secured, the IV lines being prepared by silent medical staff. At first, it was just Andrew and the team of prison officials. Then, with the push of a button, a curtain opened. Behind the glass sat two groups divided by grief and pain. On one side, Andrew's own parents, who had to watch their son die by the hands of the state. On the other, three family members of Charles Newman, the 80-year-old grandfather Andrew had brutally killed 8 years earlier. Two families bound together forever by one violent act, staring into the face of finality. As the curtain opened, Andrew slowly raised his head. His eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on the witnesses. He looked directly at them, at his mother, his father, the victim's kin, and then just as quickly he turned his head away. It was as if the weight of all those eyes, all that judgment and grief, was too much to carry. When asked by the warden if he has a last word, he replied, "No, sir." There were no last words, no apology, no explanation. Andrew stayed silent, his breathing steady but shallow as the executioner prepared the lethal cocktail of drugs. His chest rose and fell once, twice, then slowed. For his parents, it was a moment of unspeakable horror. To watch the son they once held as a child now lie motionless as poison coursed through his veins. For the Newman family, it was a grim, heavy closure. At 6:25 p.m., Andrew Lackey was pronounced dead. The state of Alabama granted Andrew Lackey's request to be executed at just 29, despite documented signs of mental instability and a failed suicide attempt. This decision raises difficult questions. Was justice truly served, or was a deeply troubled man allowed to choose death before proper mental evaluation and treatment? Executing someone who may not have been fully stable challenges the balance between justice for victims and compassion for offenders. Justice must punish, but it should never abandon humanity. When mercy is absent, justice risks becoming vengeance.